This is the moment the Gulf stopped breathing. As of 6:47 in the morning, Friday, April 17th, 2026, a two-line statement came out of Tehran that quietly rewrote the rules of everything happening in this region right now. Brigadier General Hossein Salami, commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, stood in front of the cameras and said this, and I want you to hear every single word. The Persian Gulf is not an American lake. Any hostile economic action against the Islamic Republic will be met with a response that reaches every corner of this sea. No terminal, no platform, and no port will be immune. He did not name America. He looked directly at Bahrain, at the UAE, at Saudi Arabia, and at Qatar, and he said no port will be immune. If you are following this story and you are not yet subscribed, hit that button right now, because what is unfolding in the next 72 hours is moving faster than any headline can keep up with. This is not a drill, and this is not routine posturing. Here is what every major outlet completely missed today. They called it a military warning. They filed it under Iran threatens escalation again. And they moved on. But if you stop at the military reading, you have missed the entire story. Because Iran is not threatening to fight. Iran is threatening to strangle. And the reason Iran feels confident enough to make that threat today, bombed, sanctioned, and exhausted after 47 days of war, comes down to one country that almost nobody is talking about. And that country is not Russia. That country is China. In this breakdown, we are going to show you exactly how China built the financial and logistical lifeline that is keeping Iran standing, why the Gulf states are far more terrified than they are admitting publicly, and what the next 6 days before the ceasefire deadline on April 21st will tell us about whether this war ends or explodes. Iran is not just threatening. Iran is negotiating. And it is doing it from a position of manufactured confidence that should not exist. But it does, and China built it. 3 years ago, in the spring of 2023, China and Iran quietly signed what was described at the time as a routine trade cooperation agreement. The Western press barely noticed. A few analysts filed short notes. Most editors killed the story before it ran. The agreement covered oil, infrastructure, shipping lanes, and financial clearing mechanisms. And it was designed from its very first page to function completely outside the reach of the American dollar and the SWIFT banking network that American sanctions depend on. The plan was simple on the surface. China would buy Iranian oil. Iran would receive payment in Chinese yuan. The transactions would clear through Chinese state banks that had no exposure to the American financial system. It was supposed to be a quiet economic arrangement between two countries that both had reasons to reduce their dependence on Washington's financial architecture. But the hidden stakes went far deeper than a trade deal. What China was actually building, slowly, quietly, rung by rung, was a parallel economic immune system for Iran, a system designed to keep Iran financially alive no matter what America did, not if America sanctioned Iran, when. China assumed it was coming. China built accordingly. And the people who understood what was being constructed stayed very quiet about it because the moment Washington fully understood what had been built, the diplomatic consequences would be severe. Iran's leadership, for its part, made one enormous gamble. They assumed that as long as China's economic lifeline held, they could survive any military or financial pressure America applied. They assumed that Chinese interests in cheap Iranian oil, in blocking American dominance of Gulf energy flows, and in keeping a U.S. adversary functional in the Middle East were all strong enough to make China stay the course. They assumed China would not blink. They assumed wrong about many things in this war. But on that specific calculation, they have not been wrong yet. At 9:15 in the morning, local Gulf time on Wednesday, April 16th, 2026, the tracking systems used by 3 major global shipping intelligence firms all registered the same anomaly at almost exactly the same moment. A supertanker, one of the largest class of vessels that operates in Gulf waters, had turned off its automatic identification system transponder approximately 40 nautical miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz. It went dark. On every satellite map, on every commercial shipping dashboard, it simply ceased to exist. And then, 11 hours later, it reappeared, now inside Chinese territorial waters near the port of Zhoushan, fully loaded, No documentation filed with any international maritime authority, no inspection record, no port clearance from any Gulf state. Pause. That tanker moved 3,400 nautical miles in 11 hours with its tracking system switched off and arrived safely in China with a full load of Iranian crude oil in the middle of an active American naval blockade, with 12 U.S. warships positioned across the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, while a ceasefire framework is supposedly holding. While that tanker was going dark in the Gulf, something else was happening simultaneously. According to sources familiar with Gulf Cooperation Council communications reviewed this week, the UAE's Ministry of Energy held an emergency internal session that was not announced publicly. The session was called because Abu Dhabi's own modeling showed that if Iran acted on its port threat and targeted even two major UAE terminal facilities, the UAE would face a minimum 34-day disruption to oil export infrastructure. Infrastructure that processes roughly 2.7 million barrels per day and underpins the financial architecture of the entire Emirates economy. 34 days. That is not a military problem. That is an existential economic problem. And the UAE knows it. While that emergency session was happening in Abu Dhabi, a third thing was unfolding in Beijing that almost nobody in Western media connected to the same morning. China's foreign ministry spokesperson at the regular Thursday press briefing was asked directly whether China condemned Iran's port threat. The spokesperson paused and then said, and these are the exact words, China calls on all parties to exercise restraint and to avoid actions that could destabilize the region. That is not a condemnation of Iran. That is a diplomatic non-answer designed to protect Iran's position while giving China the appearance of neutrality. Iran's negotiators heard that statement within minutes, and they understood exactly what it meant. The markets heard it too. Brent crude spiked 4.2% within 90 minutes of the foreign ministry statement. Dubai's DFM index dropped 2.8% in afternoon trading. Shipping insurance premiums for Gulf routes, the rates that determine whether commercial vessels can even afford to operate in these waters, jumped 31% in a single session. The financial world is not waiting for a military event to start pricing in chaos. It is already pricing it in right now. According to sources within the diplomatic community tracking Gulf negotiations, a secure call took place late Tuesday evening between senior Saudi and Emirati officials. The participants included representatives from both countries' sovereign wealth management offices, senior energy ministry figures, and, notably, at least one official from each country's central bank. The topic, according to two people briefed on the contents of the call, was not military coordination. It was currency. Specifically, it was the question of what happens to Gulf petrodollar arrangements if China's Yuan-based oil clearing system for Iran is allowed to operate at full scale without American consequences. It was a cold, calculated financial conversation. They looked at the Iran-China oil data, 1.84 million barrels per day, flowing to China during the heaviest American bombing campaign in recent history. And they asked a question that should terrify Washington. If China can successfully insulate Iran from American financial pressure at this scale, what does that tell every other Gulf state about the long-term reliability of the dollar-based system they have all built their economies on? They looked at the swift bypass mechanisms China had developed. They looked at the dark fleet tanker infrastructure, now estimated at over 600 vessels globally, that China has quietly assembled over the past decade to move sanctioned crude without American visibility. They looked at the Yuan clearing rails that processed Iranian oil payments without a single dollar touching the transaction. And they realized, according to one person briefed on the discussion, that America had not just lost control of Iranian oil exports. America had lost visibility into them entirely. The decision made in that call was not to go public. It was to quietly accelerate each country's own internal conversations about yuan-denominated trade settlement for a portion of their non-American energy exports. Not as a political statement, as an insurance policy. When the Gulf states start quietly building yuan infrastructure as a hedge against dollar dependency, that is not a footnote. That is a structural shift in the global financial order. And it is happening right now in the background because of what China built for Iran. Why did China do this? Follow the logic, not the rhetoric. China is the world's largest importer of oil. Before this war, Iran was supplying roughly 12% of China's total crude imports at a discount of approximately $10 to $13 per barrel below market rate because of the sanctions environment. At 1.84 million barrels per day, that discount is worth somewhere between $18 and $24 million every single day to Chinese refiners per day. Over a year, that is more than $7 billion in pure cost advantage that Chinese industry enjoys over American and European competitors who cannot legally touch sanctioned Iranian crude. China is not supporting Iran out of ideological solidarity. China is supporting Iran because Iranian oil is the cheapest major crude supply on Earth, and the discount exists entirely because of the sanctions architecture that China is simultaneously helping Iran evade. This shifts power in a way that American policy has not yet fully grappled with. America's maximum pressure strategy assumes that financial isolation will force behavioral change. But financial isolation only works if it is total. If one major buyer, the world's largest oil importer, opts out of the isolation architecture, the entire framework develops a hole big enough to drive a supertanker through, which is exactly what happened, literally. China's foreign minister met with Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov on April 14th. Putin is now confirmed to be visiting Beijing in the same calendar window as Trump's planned May summit in China. Russia and China are coordinating their positions on this war at head of state level. And America is engaging with both of them as though they are separate problems to be managed individually rather than a coordinated strategic partnership that is actively working to exhaust American leverage in this region. What historians will likely call the Iran-China economic shield. This system of Yuan payments, dark fleet logistics, teapot refinery processing, and bonded storage that kept Iranian oil revenue flowing through 47 days of American airstrikes represents something genuinely new. This is not Soviet-era bloc solidarity. This is commercial infrastructure that happens to neutralize Western financial power as a side effect of serving Chinese economic interests. That is far harder to confront diplomatically than ideological alignment because it has a legitimate profit motive at its core that China can point to at any international forum. America knows this, which is why Washington has not yet found a clean answer to it. The legal exposure is also real. 3 Chinese-affiliated entities were designated by the U.S. Treasury under existing Iran sanctions authorities in the past 60 days. 2 of them continued operating. The third restructured through a Hong Kong intermediary and resumed within 11 days. Sanctions without enforcement consequences are not sanctions. They are suggestions. Here is the domino effect that nobody wants to say out loud. If Iran follows through on even one targeted strike against Gulf port infrastructure, shipping insurance for the entire Gulf region becomes effectively unavailable at commercially viable rates. If shipping insurance is unavailable, commercial vessels stop transiting the Gulf. If commercial vessels stop transiting the Gulf, global oil supply loses roughly 20% of its daily seaborne volume in a matter of weeks. If that happens, the economic shock is not regional, it is global. And it arrives at a moment when the American economy is already absorbing the inflationary pressure of 47 days of elevated military spending and elevated oil prices. We are looking at a scenario where the cost of inaction matches the cost of escalation. That is the trap Iran has constructed. And China's support is what gave Iran the time and economic breathing room to construct it. Foreign leaders are watching this with an attention that Washington should find deeply uncomfortable. India, which imports approximately 850,000 barrels of Iranian crude per day through its own informal clearance mechanisms, is watching to see whether America establishes a precedent of tolerating Chinese circumvention of its sanctions framework. If that precedent holds, India has every reason to expand its own non-dollar oil trade arrangements. Brazil is watching the same dynamics unfold in relation to its own long-term energy import strategy. The global south is taking notes. A desperate Iran backed by a confident China is showing every mid-sized power in the world that American financial pressure has a workaround. And the workaround has a name, Yuan. Where is a clear, unified American response? There is silence in the place where a strategy should be. The State Department briefing on April 16th produced no direct statement about consequences for Chinese entities facilitating Iranian oil exports. CENTCOM has issued no public communication about the dark tanker incident in the Strait of Hormuz. The White House, at last report, was focused on framing the May Trump-China summit as a trade negotiation, not as a moment to extract Chinese concessions on Iranian support. The message being received in Beijing and Tehran is that the threat of using the May summit as leverage over Iran policy is not being treated as a serious instrument. And when your threats are not treated as serious, they stop functioning as deterrents. Reports from people close to the administration's internal Iran deliberations describe a decision-making environment that is stretched thin. The simultaneous management of the blockade, the ceasefire countdown, the back-channel negotiations through Pakistan, Turkey, Oman, and Egypt, and the approaching Trump-China summit is producing what one former senior official described to a foreign policy publication this week as a coordination deficit at exactly the wrong moment. That is not the language of confident strategic clarity. That is the language of overextension. The dark tanker is not just a ship. It is a symbol. It is the visible proof of a system that has been operating invisibly for years and is now operating openly enough that 3 satellite tracking firms caught it simultaneously. And the system kept running anyway, because the people running it have correctly calculated that the consequences will not arrive fast enough to matter. Iran's General Salami stood in front of the cameras on April 17, 2026, and threatened every port in the Gulf, not because Iran has a superior military. Iran's military has absorbed 47 days of American airstrikes and is a fraction of what it was. He made that threat because Iran has something more durable than military superiority right now. Iran has financial survival. And financial survival, when your enemy's primary weapon is financial strangulation, is strategic victory. You can spin a military setback. You cannot spin an oil tanker that crossed a naval blockade, disappeared from every satellite, and resurfaced in a Chinese port with a full cargo hold and 0 consequences. So where does this actually stand right now? On April 17, 2026, Iran is making port threats from a position of economic resilience that American sanctions were specifically designed to eliminate and have failed to eliminate because China opted out. The Gulf states are privately terrified, quietly building Yuan hedges, and publicly saying nothing because they cannot afford to openly challenge either America or Iran simultaneously. China is maintaining a perfect public posture of neutrality, while its tankers, its banks, and its refineries do the operational work of keeping Iran solvent. And America is 6 days from a ceasefire deadline with a strategy that addresses Iran, but has not yet formally addressed the Chinese infrastructure that is making Iran's defiance possible. As we head into the final days before April 21st, expect Iran to continue making statements that are aimed at Gulf capitals rather than Washington. Iran will try to deepen the wedge between America and its Gulf partners by making Gulf leaders feel that their infrastructure is at risk specifically because of their association with the American blockade. Iran will almost certainly make a move, diplomatic, logistical, or symbolic, designed to demonstrate Chinese backing in a visible way before the deadline. It could be another tanker transit, it could be a joint statement, it could be something that has not yet been attempted. But the pattern is clear. Every time Iran tests a boundary and the consequences do not arrive, the next test gets bolder. The China-Iran economic architecture is not going to be dismantled in 6 days. The dark fleet is not going to be grounded by a summit that has not happened yet. The Yuan clearing rails are not going to be shut down by sanctions designations that have already proven insufficient to stop operations. What cannot be undone in the short term is the structural reality that Iran has successfully demonstrated to every government watching that American financial pressure can be neutralized if you have the right partner. That demonstration has already happened. The world has already seen it. When the ceasefire deadline arrives on April 21st, the question will not just be whether Iran and America reach an agreement. The The question will be whether any agreement reached can actually hold in a world where China has shown that it is both willing and able to keep Iran economically functional regardless of what Washington decides. That is the new variable. That is the China angle nobody expected. And it changes every calculation from here forward. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now. The April 21st deadline is 6 days away, and every development in the next 72 hours is going to tell us whether this ends at a negotiating table or escalates into something that none of the parties involved, including China, actually want, but may no longer be able to prevent. Watch the State Department. Watch CENTCOM. Watch what China says. And more importantly, watch what China does not say. Because in this story, as in most stories that actually matter, the silence is where the real message lives. Stay close. This is moving fast.